mausoleum rose from the rain-damp lawn like a small, pale fortress of marble. Statues of angels with gilt wings watched over the names chiseled into stone. Goret Belmon stood under the black umbrella and felt, as she always did on this day, a precise and measurable distance from the grief she kept like an heirloom. 5 years had made the edges blunt, but not the shape. Her gloves were leather, her coat a careful drape of Chanel that did not know how to fold around sorrow. The gardener had arranged the roses in a neat swirl. A staff member hovered a respectful step back, as if the air around her might break like fine glass. She expected a clean silence. Instead, she found 2 figures at the base of Giuliano's stone. A young woman, shoulders bowed, hair tied back in a practical knot, and a child of 4 with a dress that had once been bright and now was flushed by mud and weather. They were kneeling on the cheap plastic of an umbrella turned to shelter a pot of wildflowers. A clumsy, humble thing. A yogurt cup replanted with something brave and small. For a second, Goret thought the mourners of some obscure cousin, another poor soul who had wandered a wrong part of the cemetery. Dignity, in Goret's life, had always been about appearances. The young woman looked up when Goret's voice, cool and precise, broke the rain. "You cannot be here," Goret said. She did not raise her hand in accusation. She let the correctness of her language do the work. "This place is private." The woman's face hardened, not at the tone but at the assumption. She straightened as best she could and offered what little she had of civility. "We mean no harm. We came to say goodbye." Goret stepped closer, the urn of roses heavy at her elbow. Up close she saw the girl's skin crusted with flakes of dried earth, her nails bitten down to the quick, a small tangle at the ear where a lock of hair curled. The child's eyes, dark and wide, found Goret and held on, as if she knew how to measure the small ways strangers could unravel someone under a look. The child had a tiny birthmark at the curve of her shoulder, a pale crescent, like a fingernail crescent of moon. Goret's mouth set. She had known every feature of Giuliano's body when he was alive, and smaller than her regret. The angle of his jaw, the freckle by his left eyebrow, the crescent-shaped birthmark at his shoulder, a bruise of pigment she had long memorized on the back of his right arm. The recognition was almost bureaucratic at first, a line in a ledger. Then it landed in her chest like a coin. The child began to sing. It was a threadbare thing, the kind of half-remembered melody that clung to the bones of a home. The tune was small, a rocking pattern in a minor key. Her voice was thin but sure, and as she rounded the last phrase she slipped into Portuguese without thinking. "Ciao, papayanho," she sang, the syllables soft and precise. Goret had not heard those words since Giuliano's mother hummed them to him as an infant, a private, ridiculous phrase she had never meant to share. It was the lullaby Giuliano had made into a joke. He used to sing it when he was trying to make a stubborn server in the kitchen laugh. He sang it when he scraped his knee. He had sung it once, impossibly, in a phone call across a noisy bar to the woman he loved, and the tone in his voice had been the first time Goret felt a thing like breach. The lullaby broke something in her the way a small animal might break glass. Not out loud, but inside, a clean, fatal crack. Her hand left the roses. The leather creased at her knuckles. The staff member who had followed her, Mr. Romero, stepped forward automatically, preparing to say the things that would return order: names, ID, removal. Goret raised one finger. No. She could not have said why she did it. She only knew she was already 5 years late for having done what needed to be done. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, and her voice was quieter now. The aristocracy slipped from it like a coat. The young woman swallowed. Her hands played with the hem of the girl's dress, as though that small ritual steadied her. "He taught her," she said simply. "Giuliano taught her." The name, Giuliano, moved through the sheeted rain and landed on Goret like a slap. She remembered standing in a hospital corridor, the sterile light, the metallic smell, the sound of surgeons speaking fast and unemotional, and the way the world narrowed to a single sentence. Your son is gone. 5 years of carefully arranged denial, of keeping grief useful and small, had been built on that moment. Now the name was back with a child singing the private lullaby. A detail she had never planned for had arrived and would not be purchased away. You say his name as if you loved him, Goret said. It was accusation and confession in one. You say it as if you knew him. The woman's eyes filled, but not with the kind of tear that sought pity. Her voice was steady. There was nothing theatrical about her grief. I knew him. We were together, she said. He asked me to promise something, to keep Maria safe if the worst happened. She pointed, almost ashamed at the gesture, to the yogurt cup with wildflowers. He left it with a friend, an envelope, a pen drive. He said, if they try to make me disappear, don't let them take her with the lie. Goret felt the fine line of her planned life tremble. Why was this secret? She asked, the question not rhetorical. Why would my son hide this? Paula, the woman, blinked, and for the first time showed a flash of anger that was not supplication. Because your family kept Giuliano at arm's length, she said. Because he was poor. Because he worked on a report that made certain people angry. She wrapped her free arm around the child and pulled her closer, a shield as much as a gesture of comfort. Because he feared for both of us. For a long moment the rain and the marble and the sound of fountain water conspired to make the world very small. Goret had spent 5 years arranging a life that excluded error, that minimized vulnerability. Her son's danger, the one she had never thought to anticipate, was now standing in front of her, in dirt-streaked shoes and a plastic cup of flowers. Pride insisted she should point the staff's proper indignation at them both and remove them by polite eviction. Guilt, a less polished but more persuasive force, tugged in another direction. The husband of silence inside her, the ledger of propriety, the unspoken rules about what belonged behind which walls, hovered at the edge of movement. Goret found, reluctantly, that some other thing had already moved. It was memory, and for the first time in half a decade, it had hands. Giuliano had been a son who loved small rebellions, a wrong-angled tie, a Beethoven record out of order, a casserole that no one in the family had touched because it wasn't the brand they considered respectable. He had been a child who hid packets of cheap crackers in his pockets for his younger cousins at birthdays because he knew where appetite gathered and where it did not. He had been clever enough to work in the company, but not careful enough to build a life the family approved. He had loved someone the family did not approve of. Goret's reality rewrote itself in the space of a breath. She could throw them off the grounds and keep the roses and the scripture of appearance intact. Or she could do something unprecedented, bring them, dirty and honest, into the house that had always been the center of her life. She made a choice that stunned even her. Come to the house, she said. The woman's face shifted first through disbelief, then relief so fierce it made her hands tremble. The child, who had been tired from a day of walking and waiting, smiled as if the sky had folded for them. We cannot stay long, Paula said. People talk. Then do not talk, Goret answered. She did not smile. That would have been an affectation she could not afford. She turned and walked toward the black sedan waiting in the drive, the staff scurrying, Mr. Romero at her heels. The roses were heavy and unneeded now. She abandoned them on the marble as if the gesture were a release. Stay with the story to see what a single secret can do. Inside the car, the child curled against Paula's side, with the small sleep of those still young enough to believe that being close to a person is being close to safety. Paula's fingers were rough from labor, nail beds with tiny soil stains, and Goret, watching them, felt an immediate, petty shame. She knew the names of the brands the household used, the sources of the private doctors, the preferred florists, the exact points of contact for her furniture repair people, but she had never thought how hands like Paula's came to be so marked with weather. The Belmon mansion did not look different in the rain. It would not register in a wider world as changed by the presence of two damp strangers. But inside the doors, there was a small rearrangement of gravity. Marta, the housekeeper of 30 years, met them in the marble hallway. Her face folded into the kind of disapproval women of the servitude class had learned to keep for those in their charge. Marta had watched the house through generations, and the clarities of who belonged where had been part of the only religion she had ever trusted. "What is this?" Marta demanded. Her voice had the sturdiness of old wood. "Madame, you cannot bring—" "They will have food and a room," Goret said, and the novelty of the sentence was as much to her as to Marta. She was giving an order that unsettled the social order of her home. "You will prepare the west guest room, hot water, clean linens." Marta's mouth tightened. She looked at Paula with the kind of appraisal that married curiosity and contempt into a lifelong profession. "There are rules," she said. Goret closed her eyes for a second. The soft, small weight of the child leaned against her in the doorway, as if by intuition the girl had put a hand on the side of the matriarch. Goret felt some old chord of motherhood, strained, frayed, respond. She could have sent them to a shelter. She could have called the people who oversaw charities. But she did not. She had been selfish enough to want, what? Penitence? Proof of a conscience? The reasons were a braid of things. Once the house had settled into the quiet hum of servants doing what they had always done, Goret sat in her study with Giuliano's photograph on the desk and Paula across from her. Maria had been bathed. Marta had scrubbed at the worst of the dirt, wrapping the child in one of the better sheets as though that could change history. The child lay against the bed like a sleeping thing of no consequence, and yet everything. There was a small paper cup on the nightstand with the last of a cheap yogurt. Marta had placed a single stem of the wildflower from the cemetery in an old silver teaspoon, as if to give it dignity. Paula spoke in measured, practical sentences which, even when broken by emotion, returned quickly to fact. "He loved her," she said of Maria without hesitation. "He said he would do anything. He had been working on a report. He said it would show how money had been moving, secret accounts, transfers to shell companies. He named a nephew. He was afraid." Goret's face moved through the familiar stages of grief, shock, blame, a dull recognition like a legal judgment. "You're asking me to take you in because of something he left?" she asked. "No," Paula answered, "because if you can show Maria belongs to him, she will have protections. If she has nothing, she is small and unprotected." A silence gathered, large and accusatory. Goret thought for the first time of the way Giuliano had looked at her in the weeks before the accident. A mixture of longing and something like pleading. He had wanted her to see. She had not looked. She told herself then that this grief, this part of her, was not dramatic. It was not a fit. It was a quiet, logical realization that she had not been absolute in the things that mattered. Marta hovered in the doorway to listen. Romero had moved quietly between the rooms like a man still in training to be loyal to the family he had served all these years. There was an unspoken bargain forming, one made of small, impossible choices. Protection in exchange for the truth that would risk everything. "You have a letter?" Goret asked. Paula did not reach for anything in the immediate moment. The thought of Giuliano's handwriting made her fingers white. "He left it," she said. She reached into the thin bag she had carried and produced a small envelope, edges worn as if it had lived in a pocket for a long time. The envelope had no seal. It had been opened and pressed closed. Inside was a folded page, a few lines in her son's scrawl, and a small black plastic rectangle wrapped in paper. A pen drive. The pen drive was, in Goret's world, an instrument of proof. It was a small, stubborn object that could move mountains when plugged into the right machines, when verified by the right people. It promised financial trails, names attached like flies to a sticky paper. It promised culpability. She read the letter aloud because she needed to hear Juliano's voice in a place with walls that meant anything. "If anything happens to me, this is for you," she said. And the words did something inside her that felt like both indictment and mercy. One line in the folded page, Juliano's neat, careless handwriting, snagged and would not let go. "You are a great woman. You only forgot how to be sweet." Goret's breath left her in a small whisper. The sentence had the kind of bracing honesty she had been taught to avoid. It was not condemnation. It was not a plea. It was a recognition. It invited guilt without explaining how to be absolved. She could have laughed, the absurdity of her son reminding her to remember a small tenderness, but she did not. The phrase lodged like rain in the joints. That night the staff argued with one another in the kitchen. Marta occupied the moral angle and Romero, the practical. A few of the younger servants worried about the consequences of bringing strangers into a household whose reputation mattered. Rumors moved fast and loyalty had a price. Goret heard it all without comment. She did not sleep well. She walked into Juliano's room and laid her hand on the back of his chair, on the indentation the body of her son had left behind. The house seemed to hold its breath. When morning came, she called an old acquaintance, a lawyer who owed his first promotion to her family, not to gratitude but to a ledger of favors. She dialed a number that opened a corridor of possibilities. "I need discreet counsel," she said, "and I will not allow my family to be cowed." The man was swift, practiced. He made promises the world required him to make, investigations, discreet steps, proper legal channels. He spoke of chain of custody and the careful handling of a device that could be copied or corrupted. Goret listened, and then, for the first time in years, felt an uncharacteristic sense of partnership. She would use the old mechanisms of power, not to hide, but to bring the truth out. Life inside the mansion recalibrated. Maria learned the map of the house with the focused curiosity of a child who had never known such rooms. She found the library, the domestic sanctuaries of grown people, and assigned them names out loud as if claiming them were an act of survival. She put her small hands on the marble railing and watched the light change. The servants watched her with a wary tenderness. Marta's disapproval softened into a practical, no-nonsense protectiveness. Romero, who had always believed his job was to anticipate risk, found new leverage in his loyalty. Goret attempted to be ordinary in tiny, excruciating ways. She sat at dinner with a tray of small, non-ritual foods and tried to learn the rhythm of the house when it did not include the steady presence of a son's voice. She found herself listening for the lullaby. She hummed it under her breath until she mastered the tune poorly enough to make no one mistake it for mockery. Each time the phrase crossed her lips, it felt like an act of penance. Paula, for her part, guarded what Juliano had left like a talisman. She would not allow the pen drive to leave her sight without reason. She was practical as necessity had made her. She knew station schedules, names of drivers, the trusting corners of the city where a friend might hide the envelope in an anonymous locker. She knew that she had not trusted the Belmons with her name because she had been taught by experience how fast sympathy turned to pity and pity into erasure. She had made no illusions that the right hand of the family could love her. She had made a calculator of their needs. Yet there were wedge moments, small and human, where gratitude leaked in. When Marta offered Maria a bowl of warm soup without comment, Paula felt a gratitude the size of an exhale. As the days passed, Goret found herself stepping into roles that had once been settled: protector, benefactor, leader. But there was something new in those roles now. She acted with the discomfort of someone learning a language out of necessity. She promised a DNA test and arranged a pediatric appointment for Maria. She asked Romero to stand by the gate at odd hours. She called in favors to have the pen drive examined by someone her lawyer trusted, and the lawyer arranged, with a smudge of professional restraint, to have the data copied and secured while maintaining the chain of custody. What the household did not suspect was how closely watched they were. Inside the Belmon world, there were many quiet predators. Carlos, Goret's nephew, had been moving money with the skill of someone drunk on easy profit. He was a man used to the certain arithmetic of power. The company's ledgers bent under his hand like foolish paper. He had built a life of incremental cruelties given the currency of impunity. Lucrecia, his sister, smiled like a woman who thought fate was a fabric to be custom-made. They had both moved behind the present facade of grief with the calculation of sharks circling a wound. When Goret had issued the order to bring Paula and the child into her home, they had watched with something between contempt and panic. That panic became action. In the quiet of a club where business lights glowed at midnight and men measured the world in shares, Carlos spoke to strangers who were men of muscle and no conscience. He left the club with a plan that had been described without a single shaky syllable. Remove the problem. He would convince himself he was protecting a legacy. He would call it a necessary correction. To him, Maria was an inconvenient variable that could be contained. The attack came on a night the sky was a low sack of cloud and the house had grown used to the new arrangement. It arrived not with cinematic explosions, but with the small, practiced movements of men who knew how to take advantage of predictability. Romero had been on the gate. He stepped into the garden at the first noise and found a figure in black peeling away from the shadow of the cypress. There was a quiet click, a mannerly sound that signaled malicious intent. Goret was not an old woman in any document one could sign. She was a woman who had learned survival in boardrooms and had the reflexes of someone who had inherited power the way one inherits tactics. She woke in a heartbeat when a shudder of glass fractured the night. Someone had thrown a stone through a side window, an attempt to startle, to flush, and the house answered with the clatter of waking servants. Paula moved as a mother moves, swift, uncalculated and pure. She gathered Maria in one arm and shrouded the child with her body. Marta tried to shield them with furniture. Romero met the first intruder with a bluntness that was born of decades of service. In the dark, the men moved like angry birds, flashes of motion, broken laughter, the smell of cheap cologne. The house revolved into its drilled positions, doors locked, alarms that Goret had once considered indulgent, now shrilling, staff calling out. The assailants were not quiet professionals. They were men with a plan to create panic, scrape of boot on marble, a shout, the sound of a gun being readied without aiming. But then something unexpected happened. Goret, who had trained herself to measure speech and keep distance, moved like someone answering a summons inside her. She found the old pistol her father had kept in a drawer. It had a heavy weight and a history of being used once in a hunting party that no one liked to speak of. She did not point it like the villains did. She used the mere presence of it, the authority of someone who refused to be entirely powerless, to create a pause. There are images people think will define a lifetime. The long, slow fall of a curtain, the sound of a syllable someone wanted to silence. For Goret, the defining image was smaller. The way Paula's hand found hers, as if pulling on a lifeline. The pistol did not fire. Shots were exchanged elsewhere, a bang, a thud, the house answering with sudden violence, and then the coughing silence of those who had miscalculated. Romero had the advantage of surprise on his side and a long accumulated knowledge of the house's geography. He managed, with Marta's help, to get Paula and the child to the pantry, a small dark nook that smelt of preserves and sudden fear. One of the attackers leapt through a window and found, to his astonishment, that Goret was waiting in the corridor. She moved with an old, precise efficiency that had nothing to do with rage. A twist, a hand on a collar, the sound of a man cursing when his ankle found a step he had not seen. She landed a hard shove that sent him sprawling. He came up with a small, stabbing knife, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to a single human decision. Goret did something she had never allowed herself to do in public. She struck. Her fist connected with the attacker's face in a movement born of bodily memory, not technique, but a refusal to lose what she had decided to protect. He went down. The noise upstairs, a tussle, a shout, receded. The men fled as quickly as they had come. The group's cohesion dissolved into panic when their plan's edges met the sharpness of human unpredictability. One of them, a lanky figure who smelled strongly of cheap tobacco, stumbled toward the gate and disappeared into the night like spilled ink. In the aftermath, the house felt bruised. Marta's hands shook as she wrapped a towel around the child. There were no grotesque images to catalogue. No one had been killed. But Romero had a cut along his forearm and a bruise shaping itself under Goret's jaw, where a fist had found that tender place. The pistol's leather strap had scraped her palm. She walked to Juliano's portrait and realized the shock of the event had left her with a new kind of awareness. She could be fierce. When the lawyer arrived with a police officer in tow, Goret listened to the procedure, statements taken, a report filed, the promise of a discreet, if slow, investigation. The officer spoke politely about evidence and chain of custody and the risk that the assailants would come back. Goret nodded, the articulation of control. But the lawyer's phone vibrated in his pocket, and he answered in a low voice that had the cadence of a man who had just been given news that unstitched his comfort. "Sir, Carlos's men were seen on camera near the south gate half an hour before the incident." Goret looked at the lawyer as if someone had thrown a bright, unanswered question into the room. The idea that the threat had structural backing, family-backed, corporate-funded, did not cause her to shiver. It did not cause her to retreat. It clarified. If her nephew had sent men to do this, then the risk was not only physical, it was political, systematic, a narrative about what would happen when truth pressed too close. Paula in the pantry began to cry in a way that had nothing to do with theatricality or pity. Her shoulders shook with a real and human exhaustion. Maria clung to her hair, and the small child's arm brushed the birthmark at her own shoulder as if touching a map. In that brush, Goret saw the crescent of pigment and remembered the way light used to fall on Juliano's skin on summer afternoons, a memory like the echo of a song. They would need the envelope. They would need the pen drive. Goret's mind, which had been trained to measure outcomes, plotted out two immediate objectives: secure proof and secure the legal machinery that would not allow Carlos to accuse, to smear, to use wealth in the shape of a club. The small leap from grief to action had been made. The rest would be a sequence of hard, often ugly moves. Paula pulled from her bag the thin paper wrapper that had once housed the pen drive. "It's not here," she said. "I left it, at the Rodoviaria. I was going to get it to a friend. If the men were sent, maybe they looked for it in the house because they thought it would be here. Maybe they will go to the bus station next." Goret tasted a fresh metallic worry in the back of her throat. The Rodoviaria, the crowded bus terminal at the edge of the city where people came and left with the motion of lives in their pockets, was a porous place. Things could be hidden there in anonymous lockers, passed between hands like ordinary objects. It was also public. It breathed with 1,000,000 reputations, and had 100 places for a small object to dissolve into the crowd. "You will not go," Goret said immediately. "Not alone." Paula's eyes widened. It was not that she did not trust Goret to protect her. She simply had not imagined being offered help of this sort. There was a complicated mixture of fear and the old, well-earned caution that came from being poor in a world of people who could not imagine you had a mind of your own. Goret's voice, when she spoke, had the kind of brittle resolution that cannot be undone. "We will go, but not as you," she said. "We will not go on our own. We will go with help, and we will go prepared. This family does not hide from what it has done. It corrects." A plan is a fragile thing the first time it is spoken. It can be swallowed by uncertainty or hardened by the presence of people who choose to act. The mansion began to gather its allies in a quiet, urgent way. Romero called in favors he had earned by being careful. Marta, emboldened by the night's events, offered what small local knowledge she had about the bus terminal's locker keys and the men who worked there. Goret made a call to an old friend, a man who could pull a camera from a station's security room for a glance. The lawyer drafted a list of things that could not be trusted. Paula sat in the room and folded her hands in ways that were both prayer and geometry. When the sun rose the next morning, it did not wash away the dark of the previous night. It only outlined it differently, with sharper edges. Goret found herself practicing the lullaby in the privacy of her study to keep it from slipping like a cracked plate. She found herself thinking of Giuliano in ways that were new, not just as the son who had been cruelly taken, but as a man who had tried, small and private, to do what he thought right. There was an urgency in everything now, a hum like bees behind a window pane. They had the pen drive's paper wrapper and the memory of its hiding place, a locker in the bus terminal. But they did not have the device itself. They had witness statements about a vehicle that had been near the mausoleum the night before. They had a nephew who had motive and means. Goret, in her bones, felt the pull of the ledger once again. This was not simply about shame. It was about a ledger that, if exposed, would cost people their comfortable illusions. She tasted the possibility of reparation and the acuteness of the cost. To get the pen drive, they would have to move beyond the mansion's thresholds and into the city's open and indifferent geography. That meant risk. It meant meeting other people's lives at the place where they kept their secrets in public. Goret closed the study door and looked at Giuliano's photograph on the mantel. The face in the frame was younger than the grief that kept him fixed there. He had been stubborn and kind in ways she had not fully admitted. He had left someone and a child who trusted the world enough to sing a private lullaby in public, to plant wildflowers in a yogurt cup and call it a memorial. Outside, the city moved on. Buses coughing, a vendor calling out the day's bread, the world indifferent to the intimate calculus of one family's repair. Inside the Belmon house, a plan began to arrange itself with the slow inevitability of gears finding their place. They would go to the rodoviaria. They would retrieve what Giuliano had left. They would not let another man bruise a child to silence a truth. The first step was small. Secure a reliable copy of the data and ensure the device remained where it could be authenticated. They would need allies in the public stations and someone who knew the tunnels of the bus terminal. Goret wrote a short list of names and then crossed half of them off by the old arithmetic of power. Those who owed her and those who would not. She felt the newness of herself like an ache. The night's violence had taught her that she was capable of being protective in a way that had nothing to do with a ledger and everything to do with what is called mercy. It also taught her something less palatable. That to protect was to put oneself in the path of further blows. Still, she decided, standing in the doorway of Giuliano's room with the photo and the fresh bruise ghosting under her skin, that whatever else might happen, she would not allow the small singer of a forbidden lullaby to become another erased footnote on a ledger of convenience. She had spent a life keeping appearances. Now she would spend it, at first clumsily and then with growing skill, keeping a child safe. They would leave for the rodoviaria before the week was out. There were details to iron and allies to meet. Outside the drawn curtains, the city was both a map and an enemy. Inside, a child slept with a moth of a smile, and the house, old, proud, guilty, prepared to step into a battle it had long pretended not to know how to fight. They planned the trip to the rodoviaria like a stormy business meeting, specific, careful, with roles assigned and contingencies layered into the margins. Romero insisted on going despite Marta's muttered objections about propriety. "I know those streets," he said, and there was no bravado in it, only a long apprenticeship of being useful. Goret took the part of funder and negotiator. She did not pretend to be comfortable in alleys and waiting rooms, but she had learned to move there when the ledger called for it. Marta, whose disapproval had softened into something like practical affection, refused only to watch. She packed sandwiches and a small tin of coffee. Paula, who had never wanted to be rescued or become anyone's cause, agreed to the plan with the same economy she used to survive: quiet, thorough, wary. They traveled in 2 cars. Goret's choice to ride in the back seat of Romero's battered sedan was performative. She meant to be visible in a certain way that quieted questions. But she asked that everyone be inconspicuous upon arrival. Maria came with them, a small hand in Paula's, hair combed into a tidy braid by Marta's patient fingers. Goret took a hat pulled down low and shoved her gloves into her coat pocket. She felt the bruise on her jaw like a private punctuation and wrapped a scarf thoughtfully around her neck. She had not planned on being a heroine. She had planned on being useful. The rodoviaria was the kind of place that swallowed private things. People came and left with bundles and borrowed dignity. Men argued about timetables with the passion of people who had to make every minute count. Vendors called names of distant towns. The air smelled of frying oil and diesel, of old newspapers and anticipation. Locker rows stood in a fluorescent-lit corridor like small steel mouths waiting to be opened. Marta's tip, the locker number and the look of the attendant, came from 2 decades of keeping track of ordinary kindnesses. Romero's contact, an old driver who taught him how to read the bus schedules like a map of vulnerabilities, agreed to watch a security camera from the inside of a kiosk while they worked. They moved in 3 teams. Romero and Goret would distract the attendant on the locker kiosk, while Marta and Paula searched the assigned rows. Maria would stay with Romero's friend in a small cafe near the terminal entrance, far enough to be out of sight, but in a line of sight that offered comfort. Goret vetoed that Maria be taken inside the busy locker hall. She could not bear the thought of the child within reach of strangers. The first wrinkle was the amount of surveillance. Modern terminals were more camera than person. The attendant was polite and legalistic. Goret made a small display of being a lost widow of sorts. No tearful theatrics, only the precise wardrobe of someone accustomed to being believed. Romero launched into an assembly of manufactured apologies, a misplaced document here, proof of identity there. While the attendant rummaged through a locked office for a pen, Marta and Paula moved. They found 3 lockers with obvious tampering, stones jammed inside, dirt smeared on a corner, and it clenched their stomachs like an object dropped somewhere delicate. The locker they had been told about wasn't obvious. It was the kind of hiding place people used when they thought no one cared enough to look closely. A small aluminum locker at knee height, the latch clean, as if it had been oiled. Paula's fingers were steady as she turned the dial. The locker opened on a smell of old paper and cheap plastic. Inside lay a battered plastic envelope sealed with Scotch tape and wrapped in a paper napkin, the pen drive. When Paula lifted it, time thinned to a single seam. There was the small rectangle, ordinary and stubborn. It could be plugged into any laptop and betray a city's quiet accounting. Both Marta and Romero's mouths shaped the soundless exhale of people who have had worry replaced by a small victory. Paula pressed the pen drive to her chest like something holy and very fragile. They should have left then. It was the prudent move. Copy the drive, secure a chain of custody, vanish before the men noticed. But prudence is a smaller currency when the world is crowded and moving, and when the people you distrust have learned to move in predictable ways. They had not expected the lanky figure to come out of the shadows like a question they could not answer. The man who had been watching, one of Carlos's foot soldiers, stepped from behind a column and blocked the aisle. "That's mine," he said, with the careless ownership of men who imagine everything belongs to their employer, including the lives of people who cross him. He smelled of diesel and cheap whiskey. A second man slid behind him, glancing at the ceiling cameras, as if the presence of technology made him less vulnerable. Paula did not look like someone who would let a stranger decide what was hers. She straightened and folded herself into a stance that had nothing to do with class and everything to do with survival. "It is not yours," she said. "Oh? And whose is it?" the man asked, the laugh in his voice like a small animal. Goret stepped out from the edge of the kiosk. She had the advantage of having been orbitally necessary to men like this for a long time. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a bank vault. "We're leaving." The man's hand moved like he had a right to make demands. Romero shifted forward, and for a heartbeat something like the shiver of a fight flashed across the attendant's face. Then the man moved. He made a clumsy reach. Marta, who had always been more comfortable in the kitchen than in any public square, grabbed his arm and twisted with a skill born of decades of handling recalcitrant things. The man lost his balance and cursed. It was messy. A vendor's cart crashed into the aisle with a small explosion of orange juice, and people swelled toward the commotion like a river around a stone. Romero darted, shoulder first, and the pen drive was in his hand and then in Paula's. They moved like a small business team executing a practice maneuver. In, out, vanish. They did not vanish cleanly. A voice, male, thick with anger, shouted from the far side of the hall. Carlos's men were quick to their feet. In the chaos of the terminal, they were like a bad rumor, fast, loud, and wrong. A scuffle started near the ticket booths. Romero grabbed Maria and held her close as they ran, weaving among bodies and vendors, the sound of frantic footsteps echoing off the terminal's plaster. They boarded a bus as if it were the only bus in the world, breathing like people who had found the thing they had come for and were trying not to be forgiven for it. The bus smelled of sweat and paper and the late afternoon. An old man in a uniform nodded to Romero, as if the knowledge that they had come from an important house gave him an arithmetic of loyalty. The bus lurched forward and took them away. Behind them, in a strip of the terminal they could no longer see, men argued and cursed. Someone shouted that a woman had a child with a birthmark like Juliano's. Someone else laughed that they would catch them later. News would travel. Men would make choices. The small rectangle in Paula's palm was the kind of thing that could ferment rage into action. At the mansion, Goret insisted the pen drive be copied in the strictest possible way. The lawyer's technician met them in a small study with sterile gloves and a white-collar patience. They made an exact copy and logged every move. It was a ritual of modern trust. Timestamps, multiple copies, verification signatures. They wanted the data authenticated because proof that you can show in public is proof that becomes difficult to dismiss as a private vendetta. What the drive contained was less cinematic than people imagined. It was spreadsheets, emails with casual references that read like a ledger being kept with the same indifference people reserve for confidences, scanned invoices, messages to offshore companies, a recorded call, evidence that moved from ambiguous to damning the more they read. It was not a single smoking gun in the shape of a murder order. It was the accumulated arithmetic of theft and concealment. It showed transfers that could be traced with patience, signatures that matched corporate documents, and a series of memos that, when pieced together, pointed to a coordinated campaign to move company funds into shell operations. The lawyer, who had grown used to writing up defenses for men of convenience, felt his mouth go dry. "This is enough," he said. the sentence carrying the weight of someone seeing a ledger finally be exposed to light. If we secure the right prosecutor and maintain chain of custody, we can set an investigation in motion. We are not venting. We will go to the authorities. They did not go to the authorities without a plan. Goret had learned to distrust the reflexive kindness of institutional men who loved a quiet check more than a public fight. She wanted it public, but only in a way that could be used to force action. The prosecutor they found, Prosecutor Costa, moved with the methodical patience of someone who had been waiting for a case to be given to him that would matter. He read the copies of the drive in his office with a careful hand. He asked procedural questions about chain of custody, about witnesses, about motive. He spoke of warrants and subpoenas and the difference between a public spectacle and legal closure. You cannot arrest someone on suspicion alone, he said. You need evidence of intent, and you need to secure the accounts. You need a warrant. You need... He gestured to a wall of legal basics. We will prepare, but we must be precise. Goret listened, and in his precision found a new kind of tenderness, the slow movement of the law toward a truth. Make it public, she said simply. Make it a ceremony that shows this is not about revenge, it is about accountability. They planned the memorial reveal like a strategic operation. It had to be a place where the public could see the irony. The same crowd that had gathered to mourn would be the crowd that witnessed a different kind of reckoning. The anniversary service for Juliano had always been a careful event. Elites in black, speeches polished by consultants, the city's social cameras well placed. The prosecutor liked the choice. It would ensure witnesses and press. He arranged for a federal presence and for a team that could enforce the warrant. He assembled a small group of agents and made sure the evidence was independently copied to the public registry before it was shown. Carlos, meanwhile, felt the thrum of danger and could not bear the risk of letting it be public. He tried to buy silence in the old ways, calls, promises, veiled threats. Lucrecia polished her smile and called board members who owed her favors. They tried to discredit Paula, to press on rumors of opportunism. Their greatest miscalculation was underestimating three things: the stubbornness of people who care for a child, the bureaucracy's ability to be slow and then sudden, and the matriarch's new propensity for direct action. The day of the memorial was cold and dry. The sky a courtly blue that made the white marble of the mausoleum gleam like a stage. Friends and strangers gathered, a map of social life, politicians, company men, old acquaintances who pretended to be indifferent, and the press, which had learned to live on the left-hand side of tragedy. Maria, in a dark coat bought at Marta's sensible insistence, held Paula's hand and hummed the lullaby under her breath, a small act of defiance against being reduced to a scene. Goret stood at the edge of the stone steps with Prosecutor Costa beside her. She had chosen, deliberately and publicly, to be visible. Her face was still marked by the bruise of the attack, and she used it now as a device of honesty, evidence that the stakes had been literal as well as moral. Romero and Marta were close at hand, eyes bright with that odd human thing, relief sharpened by fear. The lawyer was present, his hands folded like a man who had practiced being legal in private rooms and now had to go public. The prosecutor walked toward the microphone with the calm of someone about to read from a ledger that had become a longer truth. He did not shout accusations. He did not use melodrama. He methodically explained that there was new evidence that required immediate action. He began to read the outlines in the way court officers do: transfers, shell companies, memos. He described how the pen drive and its copies had been authenticated, and how subpoenas were being issued right then. Carlos's expression shifted from attempted composure to a shade of panic. The camera lenses caught the movement and took it for the city. Lucrecia, sitting a couple of rows back, tried to keep her face steady, as if she could brute force the world into order. Then the prosecutor played a short clip. an audio of a corporate call where a name was used in a way that tied funds to an offshore account. It was not a melodramatic confession, it was a bureaucratic sentence, and that made it worse. The clip played, and a hush fell like the lowering of a sheet. The sound, ordinary and cheap, was the kind of thing that made reputations dissolve. A recorded instruction to move money and to obscure its destination. Agents who had been in the crowd stepped forward with warrants. They moved with the procedural certainty of people who had been waiting for evidence to crystallize into authority. Carlos tried to stand, to issue the kind of indignations men in his position used to weaponize sympathy. He moved toward his car. That was his first mistake. An agent touched his shoulder with the easy authority of someone who knows the math of a handcuff. "Sir, you're under arrest," she said. There was no shouting. There was a small, civilized moment of surprise and anger. Cameras pivoted. The crowd's murmurs turned into audible recognition. Men who had once taken his calls now slid away, and later would tell reporters they had no idea. An honest lapse of memory that cost them nothing in the short term. Lucrecia tried to stand and protest. Her protest was swallowed by a microphone as an agent read the charges: embezzlement, conspiracy to divert funds, and obstruction of justice. The arrest was public and theatrical only to the extent that the theater of accountability had been set deliberately in the place where the social world watched. It was not the end. The prosecutor reminded everyone that charging someone publicly was the first step in a slow legal path, that guilt required proof in court, that an arrest meant the system, the imperfect patient system, would continue its work. Paula watched the arrest with a mixture of relief and revulsion. To see Carlos, so famously untouchable, led away in handcuffs made the hunger for justice ache sweeter and more complicated. Maria, who had been watching from the lap of Marta, touched Goret's glove with the curious kindness of a child, figuring out how to be steady. The small birthmark on her shoulder blinked in the winter light like a secret. There were no miracles that day. There were, instead, documents taken, accounts frozen, a temporary board suspension at the company, whispering about reputations and the swift arithmetic of men who worked to cover their tracks. The public statement from Prosecutor Costa promised a thorough investigation, arrests where due, and a commitment to follow the money. It was a careful promise, not a victory cry. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved like a river through deliberate machinery. Subpoenas were served, bank accounts were examined, a public hearing was scheduled. Carlos retained high-priced counsel and launched a press counteroffensive, polishing a narrative about being the victim of a vendetta. He would plead not guilty. He would spend his energy in legal filings. The wheels of justice, which can be maddeningly slow, did finally stop long enough to pin a few important things down. Important bank freezes, an offer of cooperation from a mid-level accountant who had been feeling guilty, and the slow unspooling of evidence that made a courtroom an inevitability. Goret did not relish the public aspects of the fight. What she did relish, if that word could be used, was the moral clarity that had slipped into her daily actions. She began to put her money and her social capital where she felt the ledger needed it most. She hired an independent forensic accountant to follow the pen drive's trail. She made a public offer to fund protection for Paula and legal aid for any witnesses who came forward. She arranged for Maria's pediatric care and education. She did not believe charity was a substitute for justice, but she believed that preventing further harm was a necessity. Paula, who had been cautious about being a beneficiary of the Belmon's largesse, felt the complicated grace of being offered a seat at a table she had not been invited to before. She refused to be softened into dependency. When Goret suggested a job for her within the foundation that would arise, Paula surprised Goret by asking for training. She wanted to be useful on her own terms. Goret gave it to her. The trial did not move with the speed of drama. Depositions took months. New names surfaced. Lucretia's role was complicated. She had served as Carlos's public face at certain dinners and had been willing to sign documents she meant to skim over. She found herself subpoenaed, and her statements became small cracks. The public watched the slow reveal and, in that watching, learned something about how ordinary crimes of greed are often composed of small, bureaucratic cruelties. 6 months later, with a board of directors temporarily suspended and a federal investigation that would continue for years, Carlos was indicted on multiple counts. He entered a plea of not guilty at first, and then when the evidence mounted and a plea deal became the rational option, he agreed to a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony that implicated one more accomplice and aided in recovering some assets. It was not a simple resolution. It was a negotiated accounting that punished and exposed, and it left many questions still to be litigated. The public vindication was tempered by cost. The company lost contracts. Employees watched their futures rearrange. Lucretia's social life, once a salon of manicured advantages, would suffer. But the small, human victories mattered. Paula and Maria were safe in a legal sense that had weight. Romero had official recognition for his role in protecting the child. Marta was offered a position in the community center that Goret began to fund. Goret's metamorphosis found its clearest form in the work she did with her wealth. She transformed part of the estate into a foundation named for Juliano. It was not a monument to old money's capacity for guilt. It was a functional thing, a daycare that worked with low-income neighborhoods, legal clinics that helped families secure documents and protections, a small scholarship fund for children whose lives might otherwise vanish into statistics. The mansion's guest rooms became offices. The old hunting trophies that had once lined hallways found their way into storage or into donor auctions. Their presence no longer suited a woman who had learned how to hit and be hit by consequences and still remain human. She asked Marta to run the foundation's community kitchen. Marta took to the role with a mixture of pride and something that resembled vindication. "We will feed people so they can go and make their own choices," she said once, stirring a pot with the slow insistence of someone who understood that food is dignity administered in spoonfuls. Romero retired from the formal gatekeeping he had always done and took a job as the foundation's security chief, less a jailer, and more a presence who could teach the staff to read risk. Paula accepted a position as an outreach coordinator. She learned grant writing. She insisted that the foundation fund children's art supplies, because small adults need to make small mistakes without catastrophe. Maria began to attend a public school in the morning and the foundation's afternoon circle. She took to the library like a bird to a feeder, and she learned to carry her birthmark with a certain pride, not as proof of belonging, but as a story she could tell about how sometimes small signs can reroute adult lives. There were awkward moments. Old friends of Goret's drifted away, embarrassed by the publicness of the scandal. Some of the Belmons' social contracts frayed, but other partnerships formed. Teachers from neighborhoods she had never visited reached out to her with requests and plans, and she, who had once measured philanthropy as one might measure a compliment, began to set budgets and measure outcomes with the same precision she had once reserved for profit. The cemetery, where the whole story had begun, changed in subtler ways. People walked the grounds and no longer saw only cold marble. They saw a wild border of flowers near Juliano's stone, buds that seemed to resist the carefully trimmed lawn around them. Someone had placed a small plaque where the yogurt pot of Wildflowers had once stood. Goret had commissioned a modest sculpture. The original yogurt pot recreated in bronze and set on a low stone base, not to glorify poverty, but to honor the smallness that had spoken truth to power. It had a plinth with an innocuous inscription, "For those who planted hope in unpromising soil." The photograph of Giuliano stayed in the study, and sometimes in the evening, Goret would sit and hold a child's hand steady across her lap and hum the lullaby out of tune and feel a new kind of fullness that did not dissolve her regret. The line from Giuliano's letter, "You are a great woman, you only forgot how to be sweet," stayed with her like a small correction. She had not become sweet in the way hearts in novels suddenly softened. She had become someone who could be fierce and also reach to give a bowl of soup. She had become someone who could use influence to protect rather than to exclude. There were small moments that showed how public vindication had private reverberations. Romero's cut healed with a small scar that he rubbed absent-mindedly when he read reports. Marta, who had once been a figure of stern household governance, laughed one afternoon as she handed a paintbrush to Maria. The child smeared a blot of blue paint across her cheek and giggled, delighted by the permission to make a mess. Paula found herself less guarded. She accepted a coat loaned by one of Goret's neighbors and wore it without shame to a community meeting. She taught the staff at the foundation about the kind of pride that is not ashamed of your background. The legal closure was not total. Appeals lingered. Sentences were negotiated and bargained, and the slow work of recovering diverted funds continued past the public headlines. Goret's name was associated with both generosity and scandal. She could not buy absolution. She could, marginally, purchase better systems in the institutions that had allowed the theft. That finally felt like the right use of money, structural change rather than spectacle. A year after the arrest, the foundation opened a small center in a neighborhood where childhood had been eaten by neglect. The opening was low-key. There were speeches by people who had real claims to gravity. The mayor, a school principal, a social worker who had known Paula's neighborhood for decades. Maria, who had learned to take the stage in small increments, stood beside her mother and sang the lullaby, voice steady and proud. People in the audience wiped their eyes, not for melodrama but for recognition that a child's voice could cause adult worlds to reposition their moral weight. Goret gave a short speech, no cadences of apology, so much as an insistence that luck and love are partial remedies. "We must make institutions that do not rely on chance," she said. "We must protect the small things that hold people together." She spoke without the old aristocratic distance. She spoke with the practical tenderness she had learned would be required. The epilogue did not erase the scars. The family's reputation went through a period of quiet attrition and then reinvention. Some relatives who had once smiled at the right times found themselves sidelined. Carlos paid a sentence and, as part of the legal restitution, turned over some assets. They would not replace everything he had taken, but they paid for some of the foundation's initial programs. Lucretia receded into a quieter life, her social calendar a little less imposing. At the cemetery months later, the wildflowers had multiplied, and the bronze yogurt pot glinted in the late sun. People who could hardly have predicted the sequence of events walked by and felt a small curiosity. A child from the neighborhood climbed onto the base and touched the pot with a solemn, almost ceremonial reverence. Maria sat on Goret's lap and plucked a small blossom, pressing it to the bronze. It was an oddly domestic scene that contained the whole story in a miniature: grief, guilt, surprise, and the slow architecture of repair. Goret sometimes caught herself watching the child and feeling the fullness of responsibility loosen into something that might pass, into a belonging that did not require repayment. There were nights she still woke with the hardness of grief clinging like a second skin. But daylight reminded her that work existed to be done. She had endured stages of pity and scorn. Now she had the steady company of people doing the right small things. Paula and Goret were not mother and daughter by law, but they were enough like family that strangers sometimes assumed it and were not wrong. They moved through rooms with the ease of people who had crossed a test of trust. Goret took to sitting on the stoop of the community center sometimes, watching a group of children trace shapes in chalk, the same kinds of small rebellions Giuliano would have enjoyed. She would be unexpectedly tender, answering a scraped knee question with a hand that smelled faintly of hospital antiseptic and old cigarettes of someone who had spent long hours negotiating justice. The last scene returns to where the story had started in the rain, a cemetery, but in a different season. It was spring, and the grass near Juliano's stone had been left less manicured and more alive. Children ran not far from the marble, their energy aflare against the orderly stones. Maria ran to the grave with a small braid untied and a yogurt pot full of wildflowers she had picked herself. She knelt and set the pot down, then ran her fingers along the base of the bronze replica nearby, smiling as if the world had made sense. Goret, who walked with a steadiness earned by bruises and legal filings and the economy of a life rebalanced, placed a hand on the back of Paula's shoulder. They stood there like two people who had once been enemies of the same ledger and had learned how to rewrite their obligations. "He would have liked this," Paula said quietly. And there was no sliver of bitterness in the sentence now, only a small, worn affection. Maria leaned back against Goret and sang the lullaby, the melody small and sure. "Ciao, papai anjo," she sang, and the phrase folded into the air like a benediction that required no miracle, only attention. People nearby paused and let the words pass through them. Some smiled. Some did not know the song and felt only the echo of a child's tenderness. Goret picked up a small wildflower and tucked it behind Maria's ear. "Thank you," she said to Paula, and the gratitude was both personal and public, an acknowledgement that the child's life had redirected many things, including the matriarch's own moral compass. They did not pretend the world had been remade overnight. The company still had lawsuits to face. There were people who would try to spin the events to their favor. But the small, stubborn fact remained. A child's song had cracked a hardened heart, and that crack had allowed light and repair to enter. The mansion had become a different place. The cemetery, a living border of wildflowers, and a small yogurt pot, bronze and ordinary, remained as a reminder that small acts can compel large consequences. If this story touched you, consider sharing a memory of a second chance or someone who stepped into your life when you needed rescue. These stories matter, because sometimes the smallest things, a song or a birthmark or a borrowed yogurt cup, have the power to change everything.